one more presentation here before break, and it's me. So I get to introduce myself and share with you all the wonderful things I'm doing. Not really. I'm going to share with you a really specific thing in relationship to how we want to take a look at BMPs in the watershed. And the group in the back that hands out the CCA forms are going to hand out a book to you. And there should be enough copies, and you can go ahead and hand those out now if you want to back there, because we can use them throughout the presentation here. But it's basically a discussion in relationship to best management practices, and I think more important than the best management practice discussion is actually a definition of some critical concern areas that we want to look at in relationship to application of practices. The filter systems that Larry was just talking about, do we want to put those on every farm in Northwest Ohio? Every field in Northwest Ohio? Probably not, because there's a little bit of cost involved in relationship to putting those in place. I guess when I was thinking as an agronomist talking about a denitrifying filter bed, what my thought was, I really don't want to pay for nitrogen to apply to a field so that I have to filter it out and send it back up into the air where it originally came from. So there's probably some things that we need to think about from a best management practice standpoint that would be, let's make our rate adjusted to what we need out there in the field so we don't have to put that practice in. The P filter, I think, has a really interesting place just because there's some places where we may find that we don't have an opportunity to do anything else but filter out the water. So that one's a bit more of a challenge because of the soil stability and retention of phosphorus in the soil. So what I want to do is just kind of go through a few things related to the AgBMP manual, how we laid it out, and what we tried to accomplish with it. We did use the edge of field studies that were done and some of the research here in the state of Ohio as well as other places where we could find it to define some of those best management practices and the effectiveness and a little bit of the cost on them, and also define where these critical areas are that we want to think about looking at. I think always, what's the easiest sell? If I can make a farmer $5 more or cost him $5 more. Make him $5 more. And a lot of the things that we have in the nutrient area, I think there's some opportunities to think about a more efficient use of nutrients and actually end up with, if not making more money, at least paying for the practices and having a little bit of return there, potential in the long run. With a lot of the things at the edge of the field, what do you see? I see a cost to those and a cost that's going to have to be absorbed one way or another through cost share programs or our investment from a private standpoint. The other thing is with 4.3 million acres of farm ground in Northwest Ohio or the Western Lake Erie Basin, can I, myself, or all of my extension people, all of the soil and water people, all of the NRCS people, can we, in any stretch of the imagination, get out to all the different corners of that 4.3 million acres? Not really. But the folks that are operating the land, the folks that are making fertilizer applications, all of you folks that get out in those individual fields, get in the back corners, get by the woods, you're the ones that get back in to be able to see where some of these critical concerns might be and bring them to the forefront as you leave that field with a note or a call to a conservation person to say, hey, I think there's something back here that we ought to check out and see if there is a reason that we want to make a change back here to this far corner and what we're seeing back there. So what we're really wanting to do is try and define some high-risk situations that we've seen through water quality testing. Some of them are very visual in nature, and it just makes sense that, hey, we need to do something here. Some of them may be a little harder sell, but something that I think the research does back up. And really encourage you to visit as landowners and farmers with your conservation professionals as you see some of these high-risk areas. And the thing that I talk about, and the thing that I know that is a goal for SWCD and NRCS, is to get past the willing person to the person or the situation that has the highest need, and trying to put practices where they're going to have the greatest benefit so that we can start moving towards that 40% reduction, whatever the definition is of success. We're needing to and wanting to move there quicker, and putting practices in the right places very essential to that. And then I think the private-public partnership, something like we were talking about earlier, certainly is important, and trying to bring the the private folks into the conversation here is what we really tried to do. When we talk about most of agricultural concerns today in relationship to water quality, they revolve around these three different areas: erosion, phosphorus, and nitrogen. When I started, and I'm going to date myself now, I started an extension in March of 1987. I can almost not remember the date at this point. It's getting so long ago. But at that point in time, my goal, I had some water quality issues I was dealing with. What were those water quality issues that we were dealing with back in the 1980s? Well, it was sedimentation, but then also pesticides. There's a lot of discussion about atrazine, a lot of discussion about, atrazine in particular, but atrazine and some of the insecticide products from a water quality standpoint, and groundwater contamination. Do you hear any concern about pesticides today? We must have solved that problem, or at least solved it to a point that nobody is overly concerned. But these three still exist here. The sediment is still an important one, and erosion is an important one that we need to keep in mind. Phosphorus is obviously a key that we've talked about all day here in this room, and nitrogen is a key. And want to go through those three and try and point out some of those high-risk situations that we see going on in the landscape, and some things that hopefully you can take back and think about sharing with your folks on your farm and the folks that are in your ag business, and think about bringing those out if we see those in a landscape as we work this spring. Let's start with erosion. There's 14, this is from Steve Davis, since he was in the room earlier but it's gone now, calculated up something around 14,000 miles of streams in northwest Ohio, western Lake Erie Basin. Would those streams have any impact on water quality? Does this stream have any impact on water quality? We still see this stream bank erosion that's occurring in upland areas in particular, but really any place that we have streams, we see this kind of erosion possibility and potential that we need to identify. Do I need a P-index tool? Do I need spend a lot of time at the computer to figure out there might be some things that we could do better in this picture? This is a BMP that we can start making some applications. And what's some things that you would do in this situation? Do we have enough setback from the stream for our farming activities? Probably a filter strip could be beneficial here, couldn't it? What are some other things that we could have here? We could rebuild the bank, do some stabilization of that bank. We can also think, this is no-till or no tillage at this point, which was spring of 2017 when I took this photo. But there are some practices, cover crops, where we could potentially think about, and it may make a difference in this area. Somebody asked me about a two-stage ditch for this particular area. Does this look like a location that you would put a two-stage ditch in? I wouldn't think about it first thing because of what's going to happen. To get those benches and get the design in here, how much farm ground am I going to take up to get a two-stage ditch in this location? I think it's going to be a pretty significant amount. So it's going to be more focused in on some infield practices and some things that we can do other than a two-stage ditch to think about stabilizing that bank. And as you look back behind that bend, actually some similar things are happening back on that far end as you look back. And in fact, the picture, it's not much better in the book, but is on page 12 of the booklet that you have that was just passed out. So this type of stream bank ditch erosion, whether it's happening in the streams naturally or whether it's happening in some of the ditch system that we have in northwest Ohio, is certainly something that we want to think about trying to correct. What do you think about this picture? And the picture is actually also in your book on. Actually, this one is more in the back. So just take a look at this picture. What do you see going on in this picture? Sheet and rill erosion. We're developing some gullies. We've got a little bit of slope to this field. What's some things that we would think about applying to this particular situation? This is an ideal one for a sod waterway. And actually, if you go back and look at grass waterways in the book, this picture is there, and then the side-by-side where the grass waterways have been installed are then in a follow-up picture. So, you know, thinking about making corrections to what we see from an erosion standpoint, I think is still critical in relationship to what we do. If Aaron's predictions and some of the things, if you were here when Aaron Wilson was talking earlier today about more rainfall, and we've seen more rainfall, period, is this more or less important in the future? To me, it's going to be more important. And the gullies that you're seeing, the places where you may be closing in areas only once out of 5 years, now you're doing it every year. And that, to me, is a signal that we need to think about doing something different, and that different might be putting some vegetation into that area to close things in and get that erosion under control. I mean, we can try cover crops, we can try tillage, but you see the slope, you see the erosion there, and those probably aren't going to do what we need them to, and it's going to take that grassed waterway to be able to correct that problem. So erosion, and that goes towards, if we're talking about phosphorus, thinking about placement of nutrient off the surface, but that doesn't mean a plow. That means looking at some other tools in relationship to placement of nutrient below the surface, because we don't want to exacerbate the problem by increasing erosion. So some things there that we just want to think about and identify. So if you see any of that stream bank erosion, particularly to the levels that we were just looking at, infield erosion, those are situations we want to go and take a look at. These pictures in the book, I've taken most of them, or about 3/4 of them I took, and I've taken them within the past 2 years. So I didn't go back to a lot of stock photos and those kind of things. I drove around some areas of western Lake Erie Basin and got these photos so that we could see that this currently is still a problem that we need to address. So moving from erosion, let's talk a little bit about the phosphorus. The edge of field studies, you've seen these pictures several times, but this is actually one of the fields that shows one of the contributing areas, or actually the two contributing areas from a surface standpoint. This is actually the location in central Ohio at Beck's. So if you go to Farm Science Review and you've seen there at Deer Creek, that location, this is the surface contributing area for those two samplers, and then this is the tile contributing area. And you can see that those don't always overlap, that there's some differences in relationship to how they're laid out, but this is that situation and what they look like. And you know all this, so I won't spend any more time there. This is a different chart that I want to throw at you, and this is the phosphorus contribution. It is by year 2012 through 2017. Shows all of the sites, although they're cut off at the bottom. There's 2 bars for each location, and for each individual chart here, that's 0 to 3.5 is what the range is. Then the red line thrown in there is the line that would be for the Annex 4 targets in relationship to loading. And if we divided those over all the acres in northwest Ohio, that would be a target load. So it just gives you some perspective there. This happens to be just the DRP loading, and really I don't want to spend much more time with this other than to say, does every field contribute equally? Absolutely not. I mean, there's differences on a field-by-field basis, and there's differences in management that go over top of that. There's a variety of differences in relationship to phosphorus contributions, and they are not all related to just simply soil test. In fact, if you want to really try and determine what a loss potential is for a field, it goes beyond just the source piece, which is what we often talk about, of the source of the soil test level and the nutrient additions, to add to that the transport, the soil type, the drainage, the management that's going over top of that, the cover, the distance to water. Some of those transport issues are just as important as the source, and results in then that total loss in pounds per acre from an individual field. So it's not as easy as just saying we need to target soil tests at a certain level in relationship to what we need to do in the future. And by the way, it takes rainfall, and I think that's the one thing that I heard, that I was looking for it this morning in the first presentation, if you were here, where Dr. Davis was talking about the different harmful algal blooms and situations going on, and he mentioned it several times: weather, weather, weather. What do we hear when we start talking about the Western Lake Erie Basin? The good years are what? Weather was right. Bad years are what? Agriculture is making a mess of our watershed. And I think probably weather plays a role in both sides of that equation, and weather is an important tool or thing that we need to keep in mind. With phosphorus, what we want to think about are really a couple things. Certainly rate is important. There was a presentation earlier on the new tri-state recommendations, and that is going to be released here soon. So we have the then data that justifies what we need to do from an agronomic practice standpoint, and appreciate that data being updated. So rate is important, or one consideration. The other thing is the placement of that rate in relationship to the soil surface. When we have phosphorus out there, where's the highest level of phosphorus going to be in the soil profile? On the top or 8 inches down? In every situation, particularly under any kind of reduced till system, it's going to be at the very top of the soil surface. When you make a surface fertilizer application, where does that nutrient go? Obviously on the surface. What happens to the residue from the crop, particularly a no-till situation? It's on the surface. Any nutrient in that is now on the surface. We need to someplace or somehow be able to keep that nutrient in the soil, and it has some binding that happens in the soil. It's a little more complex than some of our nutrients, but it binds to the soil. So if we put on this, or we have this buildup of soil test level on the upper part of the soil profile, then we put fertilizer on top of that, we have a really high, at least for a temporary period, high soil test level. You saw from some of the data shared earlier, under a high soil test level where we're talking about what could be 400 or 500 parts per million in that upper surface for a temporary period of time, what kind of losses do you experience? Those are the highest and the greatest. And so adding just fertilizer to the surface, we get that rainfall event. Where does the nutrient go? Goes towards the ditch, goes towards any surface collection that we have in the field, maybe a standpipe and so forth. That's a surface drain. Then also can make it through the soil profile through some of the macro pores. And it's because that concentration is so high, the water moving off has an opportunity to carry that nutrient and move it off-site. Let's talk about this picture right here. What do you see going on here in that lower picture? There's fertilizer there on the surface, and there's cracks that it's fallen down. Not quite. They're not quite as big. This is May, and is actually in not the heavy clays that we're thinking of in northwest Ohio, but this is a May application of fertilizer, and this is actually a no-till field. And what else do you not see on this? Not much residue in relationship to this area. So when we think about this, this is one of the sites that has this comparison of placement on the surface and then below the surface. This was a 30 part per million soil test, and it's actually the Malick value, so it's not an extremely high soil test. The tillage is no-till. The application was a May 6, 175 pounds MAP, nothing outstanding there. On May 8th, the TD1 was tilled with a disc. TD2 was maintained as a no-till, and what we ended up with was a comparison. This is the discharge coming out. On this side, it's the reference to the black line where we talk about tiled discharge in millimeters. The red line is the discharge as far as DRP loading in relationship to the amount of dissolved reactive phosphorus in grams per hectare. TD1 is, once again, the tilled field. TD2 is the no-till field. What happens to the red line after that rainfall event that starts happening on May 12th? We see an accumulation, and the value over here is 100 on the tilled field, 400 on the untilled or the no-till field. So 4 times increase in relationship to DRP loss from that surface application. Now I ask you to think about this, and a couple times I wanted to point out scaling. How much is a gram per hectare? I should ask, Brittany was the one that got challenged on the scientific data and units. A gram per hectare, is that a 5 pounds per acre, 10 pounds per acre, 1 pound per acre, half a pound per acre? It's more like a half to a pound per acre type of loss. So on 175 pounds of P2O5, there's a little conversion between P and P2O5 that needs to go on, but we lost, less than 5%, maybe probably more along the lines of 1% of the phosphorus from that application. So not a great number, but we're dealing with phosphorus where it doesn't take much going downstream to cause an issue for us. I'm going to skip a few slides. Let's talk a little bit about, and if you were in here earlier, you probably got a better description than what I have here, but when we talk about soil tests, which is one thing that we do need to consider, if you're seeing soil tests on documents and soil test results from farms that you work with or you see, if you're seeing those soil tests be above 100 parts per million, I think it's a good thing to check out. See if that field has the potential to be contributing at some of these higher levels that justify thinking about putting some practices in place that think about water management. When we talk about addressing these high soil test fields, those values that are really out of, especially extremely out of line. I want to go back just to this slide for 1 second. This is the data that you saw on the bar chart earlier. Now it's all on one chart. What you have across the bottom is soil test level, and what you have here is the loading once again. And this is our agronomic range, and it's in a malic soil test, so about 48 or so is the upper end of that value. You can see even at soil tests where we're in the agronomic range, we can be above the target in relationship to loading. But when we get out here, and then we're also below at this point, kind of this mid-range, we're below and above the line. What happens when we get to the high soil test level? It is high, and it's always high. And it's high at the point of 1 to about 4, I think was on some of the graphics earlier. Kilograms per hectare. How much does a kilogram per hectare mean in pounds per acre? Take a kilogram per hectare times 0.9, and that's a pound per acre. So basically somewhere between a pound to 3.5 pounds per acre loss we're seeing in relationship to that high soil test level. So that's where we need to think about, because those are some of the highest losses we see is at those extremely high soil test levels. So if we're going to put the investment into a P precipitating filter, where are we going to go? A field that looks like that has that high soil test level, and think about putting that in place. There's a variety of different designs, and actually this is one that USDA ARS here is monitoring at one of the edge of field sites. This is just a picture that looks somewhat similar to what Larry had of some different designs for those filters. What we can also think about is the water management piece that Larry was covering and talking about to a great deal, and I think we need to think about, can cover crops be a portion of that or a part of that management from a water standpoint, because it's a lot, well, I don't know if it's a lot easier, but it's another option that has maybe some other benefits that we can capture from an economic standpoint. Other things that we can look at is some of those filters actually are filters that have gypsum in them, and gypsum can be a treatment from the standpoint of an infield application that may be used to address high soil test level fields. One that we may want to think about for some of our sites on the high soil test project. But then also what we need to think about, I think, is multi-layering. Think about an infield gypsum application. We go through a steel slag filter, go out through a wetland, and do that treatment, and how much phosphorus do we have at that point? I guarantee are going to be pretty close to zero, isn't it, Jed? Yeah, I mean, actually, just going through the slag filter brought it pretty close to zero. So that type of train may be needed in relationship to some of those higher contribution areas, but what is it going to take to justify doing that kind of investment? That known fact that we have a high contribution going on. Northwest Ohio, we have some of this pothole topography that goes on. The thing that we think about there is when we talk about surface water losses of DRP, which direction would we like it to go? And the hash lines are subsurface drainage. The open boxes without the hashes is the surface. Which is better water quality leaving a site? That goes through the soil and out the tile system, or that off the surface? Going through the tile system. So getting some filtering through the soil will remove and lower concentrations of nutrient. And when we have a situation like that, are there a few things that we might want to think about on this tile stand structure? What's the minimum we want to do? A little bit of grass around that might be a good thing to invest in. The other thing that we might think about is the blind inlet, where we put in a subsurface type of system that makes or forces the water to go through a base of material and then at least go through some filtering and out. As Larry was mentioning, that filter could be soil and gravel. It could be something that's a charged type of filtering system that is more suited to remove some of the phosphorus leaving a site. But we know that we're getting some surface contributions that are being measured through the tile system when we talk about that standpipe that exists like we see it there. Going to talk about nitrogen real quick, and to me the big thing on nitrogen is this is where I can make an economic case that we need to do something. Take a look at the field and take a look at the chart here and look at the scaling. That 100-pound mark per acre is what I'm looking at, which is right at that point of where it says 100 kilograms per hectare here. How many fields do we have that are losing 100 pounds of nitrogen per year? About 5 or 6. Does 100 pounds of nitrogen start adding up to some real money pretty quick? So, no, the situation on nitrogen is certainly the cost is there in relationship to thinking about doing a better job of management. And this is those mixed systems that we're talking about where we're using manure and then commercial fertilizer on top of that. And we have some work that we can do and some realistic things that we can make an economic case for going out and doing a PSNT test, maybe doing some NDBI work to adjust rate in season. And rate is the big issue that we need to think about from a nitrogen management standpoint. I'm going to just kind of skip through here and say that I hope you take a look through this book and share it with a few others. Really, that front section is aimed at trying to define some of these higher risk situations from an erosion, nitrogen, and phosphorus loss standpoint. What we tried to do in the back of the book was start to bring into effect or bring into focus the effectiveness, at least what we know today, of these different practices from a water quality standpoint, and tried to put some cost to that where we could. And then we have a website that follows up with this project, and we'll continue to keep that updated with new information. I saw several things today in presentations that we need to add to the website to add some newer information to that. So we'll finish up there.